It started as a quiet ripple in Florida's luxury real estate market, but within days it became a tsunami. Reports began surfacing that Canadian buyers were selling off over $1 billion worth of Florida properties at unprecedented rates. The reasons were manifold: concerns about taxes, rising insurance costs, and political unrest in the U.S. But the timing couldn't have been worse for Donald Trump. Sources close to Trump claim he was incensed when the news hit, seeing it not just as an economic issue but as a personal slight. These properties weren't just real estate, they represented status, influence, and the loyalty of international investors who had long been aligned with Trump's brand. Watching them flee triggered what insiders describe as a public and private meltdown, complete with angry statements to advisors, frantic media calls, and a social media tirade aimed at blaming anyone he deemed responsible. The broader implications were immediate. Florida, a key political stronghold, faced a sudden cash flow crunch in the luxury market, affecting local businesses, property taxes, and the very real estate ecosystem that had helped fuel Trump's public persona. Advisors warned that if the exodus continued, it could undermine confidence among other high-profile investors and, by extension, weaken Trump's perceived influence. Even within Trump's circle, the tension was palpable. Some staffers argued for a measured response, emphasizing economic analysis and diplomatic engagement with Canadian partners. Others urged aggressive media attacks, framing the sales as politically motivated betrayals designed to hurt Trump personally. The result? A storm of confusion and heightened frustration as the former president reportedly bounced between calls, statements, and furious social media posts. By the end of the first day, it was clear this was more than a market shift. It had become a personal and political crisis, one that threatened to ripple far beyond Florida's beaches and mansions. Trump's reaction would set the tone for how the next chapter of this crisis would unfold. By the second day, Donald Trump had clearly moved from shock to full-scale retaliation. Sources report that he immediately began a series of public and private actions designed to deflect blame and assert control. Social media posts went live, each one more heated than the last, accusing Canadian officials, Florida politicians, and even rival investors of deliberately destabilizing the real estate market. "They are trying to destroy Florida and hurt me personally," one post read, a statement broadcast to millions of followers. Inside Trump's inner circle, advisors were scrambling. Some encouraged him to take a measured approach, highlighting economic data, emphasizing stability, and reassuring remaining investors. But Trump's instinct was the opposite: attack first, attack hard. Leaks from these private sessions describe him fuming at his team, demanding answers for why international investors were abandoning Florida and threatening public retaliation against anyone he considered disloyal. The media quickly picked up on the narrative. Cable news channels ran constant coverage, showing soaring sales figures, maps of properties being dumped, and interviews with real estate experts. Each new report seemed to stoke Trump's fury as he watched his personal and political influence being questioned in real time. In interviews with allies, he reportedly linked the sales directly to political opposition, claiming this was part of a broader attempt to undermine him and his agenda. But the impact went beyond personal outrage. Florida's economy, particularly in luxury markets, began to feel pressure. High-end properties were selling below market value, creating a ripple effect on local businesses, taxes, and investor confidence. Real estate insiders noted that even non-Canadian buyers were hesitant, watching the exodus with concern, a reaction that only amplified the sense of crisis. By evening, Trump had escalated further. Public statements framed the situation as an attack on his leadership and legacy, warning that those involved would face consequences. Loyalists were mobilized to defend him, while critics argued that this was another example of a leader reacting emotionally rather than strategically. The stage was set for a high-stakes confrontation with both investors and political rivals, a drama that would only intensify in the coming days. As the story of the Florida real estate exodus went national, Canada wasn't silent. Officials confirmed that the mass sell-off was driven by economic and regulatory concerns, not political sabotage, but Trump interpreted every statement as a personal attack. According to insiders, he repeatedly insisted that Canadian leaders were deliberately trying to undermine his influence in Florida, framing the situation as a direct affront to his brand and political power. Canadian media added fuel to the fire. Reports highlighted rising property taxes, stricter mortgage rules, and political uncertainty in Florida, all cited as reasons for the exodus. For Trump, however, this was evidence of a coordinated campaign. Advisors say he demanded that the U.S. State Department get involved immediately and accused American officials of allowing Canada to get away with hurting U.S. citizens and investors. The tension spilled into social media, where Trump's posts became increasingly incendiary. He personally called out Canadian leaders by name, warned of consequences, and suggested retaliatory measures that, according to legal analysts, bordered on diplomatic overreach. Each statement drew immediate coverage in both U.S. and Canadian media, turning what could have been a quiet market correction into an international spectacle. Meanwhile, Florida politicians were caught in the crossfire. Local officials and representatives who had hoped to reassure investors and stabilize the market were instead publicly criticized by Trump for not preventing the exodus. Republican strategists warned that Trump's aggressive response risked alienating voters in a key swing state, while his base cheered the confrontational tone, deepening the divide between political calculation and emotional reaction. The economic stakes were real. Luxury homes were selling at discounted rates, local realtors reported slowing sales, and some high-profile development projects were temporarily stalled. For Trump, the combination of financial impact and perceived personal slight created a volatile mix. According to sources, he described the situation as a war against Florida, my property, and my supporters, signaling that the battle would not end with the sale of a single property. By the fourth day, it was clear that Donald Trump was taking the battle to the public. No longer content with private calls or internal memos, he unleashed a coordinated media blitz across social media, cable news, and interviews. Every post, every statement, every appearance was designed to frame the Canadian sell-off as a direct attack on him, Florida, and the United States. Trump's messaging was fierce and unrelenting. He repeatedly blamed Canadian leaders, called Florida politicians weak for failing to stop the exodus, and painted the departing investors as traitors to the American economy. According to media analysts, his posts were carefully timed to dominate headlines, ensuring that the story remained front and center for his base and the national audience alike. Cable news coverage amplified the drama. Anchors dissected Trump's claims, while political commentators debated the validity of his accusations. Every new report on property sales, investor reactions, and economic impact seemed to intensify Trump's fury, prompting a cycle of posts, interviews, and statements that kept the story alive 24/7. Internally, advisors scrambled to manage both the optics and the consequences. Some recommended data-driven responses, emphasizing tax codes, mortgage regulations, and market trends to calm fears. Others urged Trump to maintain an aggressive posture, framing the exodus as part of a broader attack against him personally. According to leaks, Trump overwhelmingly chose the latter, insisting that anger and visibility were the best weapons. The impact was immediate. Investors reconsidered deals. Florida lawmakers faced mounting pressure, and political opponents seized the narrative to criticize Trump's volatile reaction to market forces. The story had evolved from a real estate shift into a full-blown political and personal crisis, with every tweet and media appearance escalating tensions further. It was clear that Trump's approach was a high-stakes gamble. While it rallied loyal supporters and dominated headlines, it also alienated moderates, unnerved investors, and drew criticism from traditional Republicans, setting the stage for a confrontation that would define both the political and economic fallout of the Florida property sell-off. As the Florida property exodus continued, Trump's reaction moved beyond public statements into intense behind-the-scenes activity. Sources from inside his team describe a chaotic environment, with advisors, lawyers, and campaign operatives scrambling to keep up with his escalating demands. Trump reportedly called multiple allies, former cabinet members, and influential supporters, insisting that every possible measure be taken to stop Canada and punish those responsible for the sell-off. Trump's strategy, according to insiders, combined political pressure with intimidation tactics. He wanted high-profile investors who had already sold properties to be publicly shamed, and questioned the loyalty of Florida politicians for allowing this betrayal. Advisors warned that such actions could backfire legally and politically, but Trump reportedly dismissed these concerns, arguing that a show of force was necessary to reassert his dominance and protect his brand. Meanwhile, internal memos from his team indicate Trump was obsessed with optics and public perception. He demanded that every interview, statement, and tweet convey a singular narrative. Canada was deliberately undermining the U.S., Florida was under siege, and he, Donald Trump, was the only one standing between chaos and order. Staffers described him pacing, reviewing media coverage obsessively, and dictating responses that mixed anger, outrage, and threats. The political stakes were growing. Florida's realtors and state officials were struggling to calm anxious buyers and sellers, while Trump's aggressive posture risked alienating key allies. Some Republican strategists warned that his approach could damage the party's image, especially in critical swing districts where moderation and economic stability mattered more than political loyalty to Trump. By midweek, the crisis had evolved into a multi-front battle: Trump versus Canadian investors, Trump versus Florida politicians, and Trump versus the media narrative itself. Every move was charged with personal fury, every statement a weapon, and every ally pressured to mobilize resources to defend him. The exodus was no longer just about real estate. It had become a full-blown political and personal war, with stakes that could resonate far beyond Florida's shores. By the sixth day, the Canadian government had officially weighed in. Ministers clarified that the Florida property sell-off was driven by economic, regulatory, and personal investment factors, not political interference. They emphasized market realities, tax changes, and investor prudence as the main drivers. For Trump, however, this was yet another provocation, a public challenge to his authority and influence. Reports from insiders indicate Trump was furious, perceiving the statement as a direct affront. He demanded that the U.S. State Department engage immediately, threatening unspecified retaliatory measures. Advisors warned that any aggressive approach could spark a diplomatic incident, but Trump reportedly insisted that public pressure and media attacks were the only way to regain control. The media amplified the drama. Cable networks showed maps of Canadian ownership in Florida, interviews with realtors, and expert analyses of the economic fallout. Trump's social media posts mirrored this coverage, attacking Canadian officials by name, accusing Florida politicians of allowing betrayal, and warning investors to think twice before leaving properties in his orbit. Within Florida, the exodus was accelerating as panic spread among domestic buyers and sellers. Property prices dipped in certain high-end neighborhoods, insurance companies braced for instability, and some major developments temporarily froze sales. This real-world impact gave Trump additional ammunition for his claims that the exodus was an attack on both his influence and Florida's economic stability. The scene was clear: a high-stakes international, political, and economic conflict, with Trump at the center, framing himself as both victim and defender. Canada remained firm, Florida markets wobbled, and Trump's allies were scrambling to manage a crisis that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Trump's relentless campaign against Canadian investors and Florida politicians quickly triggered a political backlash. Republican strategists warned that his aggressive public attacks could alienate key voters in swing districts, while traditional conservatives criticized his emotional and chaotic handling of the crisis. Some party leaders privately expressed concern that the situation was damaging Trump's credibility and the broader GOP brand. Media coverage escalated the drama. Analysts debated whether the exodus represented a financial market correction or a politically motivated act, and Trump's fiery response became the focal point. National news outlets ran continuous coverage of his statements, social media posts, and threats, portraying the situation as both an economic and political emergency. Within Florida, lawmakers faced intense pressure. Local politicians were torn between defending their constituents, stabilizing the market, and managing Trump's wrath. Some quietly advised residents to hold property and wait for stabilization, while others publicly defended Trump, creating a fractured and tense political landscape. Meanwhile, Trump's social media presence fueled speculation about further escalation, including potential legal or economic actions against Canadian investors. Experts warned that this approach could harm international relations, investor confidence, and his political standing, but Trump's focus remained personal. He was determined to reassert dominance and portray the exodus as a betrayal. It was evident that the crisis had transformed from a real estate story into a multi-layered political and media battle, one that threatened Trump's relationships, Florida's economy, and the perception of stability in both domestic and international arenas. The real-world consequences of the exodus were becoming unavoidable. Luxury property markets in Florida saw rapid price adjustments, with high-end homes selling for below market value. Realtors reported hesitation among prospective buyers who were unsure whether the trend would continue. Insurance companies and developers expressed concern over potential instability, while local governments braced for declining property tax revenue. Trump's public outrage only intensified investor anxiety. Every social media post, every interview, every statement framed the exodus as a targeted attack, making investors feel caught in a political and economic storm. Some Canadian investors worried about potential backlash, delayed sales, or explored alternative markets, while domestic buyers hesitated to enter a volatile environment. Financial analysts warned that if the exodus continued unchecked, Florida's high-end real estate market could experience long-term disruption. Developers of luxury condos, waterfront estates, and exclusive communities began reassessing their projects, wary of declining interest and the potential for Trump's political theatrics to affect property values. Even Trump's allies began to express concern. While loyalists cheered his aggressive posture, advisors recognized that the intersection of politics and finance was creating unpredictable consequences. Trump, however, doubled down, insisting that threats, public pressure, and his personal outrage were the only tools capable of stemming the tide. The stakes were clear. The exodus was no longer just a market correction or a personal slight. It was a political, financial, and reputational crisis with consequences that could reverberate across Florida, the U.S., and beyond. By this stage, Trump had moved from reactive anger to strategic aggression. According to insiders, he began exploring legal avenues, potential sanctions, and public campaigns to pressure both Canadian investors and Florida politicians. Advisors warned that such actions could have serious legal, diplomatic, and financial repercussions, but Trump remained convinced that showing force was the only way to regain control. Trump's social media activity became increasingly directed, naming investors, politicians, and business entities, implying that failure to comply with his expectations would carry consequences. This behavior ignited further media coverage, with analysts warning that it blurred the line between political commentary and intimidation. Political figures in Florida scrambled. Local and state officials were forced to issue statements calming markets, clarifying that property sales were voluntary and assuring the public that no punitive measures were being enacted. Despite these efforts, Trump's rhetoric kept the spotlight firmly on the crisis, heightening tension both domestically and internationally. It was clear Trump's response had evolved into a high-stakes confrontation, blending public fury, strategic threats, and political pressure with far-reaching consequences for the real estate market, party dynamics, and international relations. As the week drew to a close, the crisis reached a critical juncture. Florida's luxury market teetered, Canadian investors had sold off billions, and Trump's aggressive public posture had polarized both supporters and opponents. The former president faced a dilemma: continue his high-stakes confrontation or risk losing credibility and influence in a state that has long been central to his brand. Advisors reportedly urged caution, pointing to potential long-term damage to Florida's economy and Trump's political legacy. Loyalists, however, argued that strength and visibility were paramount to maintain dominance over the narrative. Trump appeared unwilling to compromise, insisting that this was a battle for reputation, power, and loyalty. The fallout was not limited to politics and finance. Media coverage amplified public perception of instability, sparking debates about governance, diplomacy, and the intersection of personal interests with national influence. Every tweet, statement, and interview added fuel to the fire, making it impossible to separate market realities from political theatrics. The stage was set for what could become a defining moment in Trump's post-presidency influence. Florida's real estate market, Canadian investors, and U.S. politics were all caught in a delicate balance, with Trump at the center, determined to fight back, but with consequences that might reshape both his image and the state's economy for years to come.